What a way to start a story, right? Our story here begins in a small Japanese fishing village, and not with some big explosion, but with this really strange and terrifying omen. Something was just deeply, deeply wrong with the animals.
Yeah, check this out. A local paper reported on this bizarre thing the residents were calling cat epilepsy. I mean, picture it. Cats would just start staggering, spinning in circles, and then just throw themselves into the sea. It got so bad the entire local cat population was completely wiped out. This was the first very loud warning sign.
So what we're looking at today is the story of two tragedies in Japan, and at first glance, they seem completely different, right? One's an act of war, the other's an industrial disaster. And this is the crazy part, they are so deeply connected by the shocking ways their victims were just forgotten by their own society. Okay, so first up, the poisoning of progress. To really get what happened here, we have to look at the bigger picture. We're talking about post-war Japan and this intense, all-consuming drive for power and prosperity. It was this ambition that really set the stage for these two distinct, yet hauntingly similar, catastrophes. So let's break it down. You've got two disasters. On one side, there's Minamata. The source? Industrial pollution. A chemical company called 𝗘𝗂𝗃 Corporation, a huge part of the local economy, by the way, was just dumping its industrial wastewater right into the bay. And on the other side, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The source there? Atomic bombs. The poison was radiation from U.S. nuclear weapons, dropped during World War II. So two totally different sources of poison, but both were kind of unleashed in the name of a national priority, whether it was economic growth or ending a war. Let's focus on Minamata for a second. The poison here was something called methyl mercury. It's this super toxic organic mercury compound, and it just silently seeped out of that 𝗕𝗂𝗃 plant, contaminating the entire bay. The really awful part is that this toxin built up in the fish and shellfish, which was, the lifeblood and staple diet of the whole community. Now, for the survivors of the atomic bombs, the poison was totally different. It was invisible. It was radiation. And it created this new, completely unwanted social class of people known as the 𝗵𝗱𝗀𝗀𝗃. It literally means explosion-affected people. And they carried these unseen scars of the bomb right inside their own cells. So that brings us to our next section, the sickness of society. Because look, the physical suffering from both the mercury and the radiation, it was just horrific. But for the survivors of both these tragedies, the social sickness that came next, the fear, the prejudice, the isolation, that was in many ways just as devastating. Wow, okay, when you lay it out like this, the parallel is just chilling. In both situations, the victims were basically treated as contaminated. Society was terrified that their conditions were contagious, so they were ostracized, they were rejected for marriage, they lost their jobs, and it was all because of this horrible misinformation and this deep-seated fear of their so-called perverted blood or affected genes. And this fear of genetic damage, it just destroyed relationships. I mean, listen to this quote from Kazuo Inoue, 𝗵𝗱𝗀𝗀𝗃. It's just heartbreaking. She says her sister's mother-in-law found out she was an A-bomb survivor and straight up forbade her from having kids. That marriage, well, it ended after just a few years. It's such a profound, personal tragedy, born entirely from societal prejudice. And here's the thing. Tragically, that fear was actually rooted in a terrible truth. The poison was passed to the next generation. In Minamata, you had babies born with congenital Minamata disease, suffering from these severe disabilities. And among the 𝗵𝗱𝗀𝗃, babies who were exposed in the womb sometimes developed conditions like microcephaly, a smaller than normal head. These poor kids were victims of events they never even directly witnessed. But it gets worse. The victims' suffering wasn't just about the poison and the prejudice. It was made so much worse by what you could call a conspiracy of silence. People in power, the ones who could have helped, they actively and deliberately chose to just look the other way. Take the 𝗕𝗂𝗃 Corporation. They knew they were responsible for years before they were officially blamed. Get this, their own hospital director, a Dr. Hosokawa, ran a secret experiment on a cat they called Cat 400. He fed it wastewater from the factory, and guess what? The cat developed the exact symptoms of Minamata disease. The company buried those results. Instead, they put on this big PR show, installing a so-called treatment system that was, for all intents and purposes, completely useless. And this timeline really just reveals the whole story, doesn't it? The disease was officially discovered way back in 1956. But it took the Japanese government 12 full years to finally officially acknowledge that 𝗕𝗂𝗃's plant was the source. For 12 years, while officials just failed to act, the poison kept flowing. And here's that parallel silence again. For 7 years after the war, the US-led occupation of Japan enforced this really strict press code. It was basically an embargo. It banned all Japanese media reports, all research on the atomic bombs. The suffering of the 𝗵𝗂𝗀𝗃 was just completely erased from public.
Okay, so this brings us to the unending struggle. Because despite being silenced, stereotyped, and totally ignored by both corporations and governments, the victims, well, they refused to be erased. They started a long, and I mean long, and difficult fight for justice.
You had fishermen literally storming the 𝗬𝗃 plant. Victims groups started filing lawsuits. You had Korean 𝗵𝗂𝗀𝘀𝗃, who faced this horrible double discrimination, fighting for decades just to get some recognition. And can you believe this? Some victims, like the ones exposed to the radioactive black rain in Hiroshima, didn't win their legal battles and get officially recognized as 𝗵𝗂𝗀𝗃 until 2021. That's just wild. Eventually, though, the courts did catch up. In 2004, a huge ruling came down from Japan's Supreme Court. They said it wasn't just 𝗬𝗃's fault. No, the government itself, both national and local, was legally responsible for the whole disaster because they completely failed to protect their own citizens. So, let's step back. What's the big takeaway here? The story of Minamata, it's often described as a mirror. And it's not just reflecting the past. It reflects some really uncomfortable truths about our society that are, frankly, still with us today. And this really gets to the heart of it all. In both of these tragedies, the health and the dignity of a minority group, fishermen in some small village, or survivors of a terrifying new weapon, they were sacrificed for what was seen as the greater good. And it didn't matter if that good was rapid economic progress or the stability of a nation after a war. The cost was paid by the few for the benefit of the many.
You know Dr. Hasakawa, the guy who secretly proved 𝗬𝗃 was guilty with 𝗵𝗱𝗺𝗺 and then later testified against his own company? He left us with this incredibly powerful and timeless warning. He said, regarding pollution, prevention is a far more important task than relief. Because once the damage is done, it can never, ever be truly undone. And that really brings us to the final, very challenging question for all of us. The stories of Minamata and the 𝗵𝗂𝗀𝗃𝗀, they force us to ask ourselves, what warnings are we ignoring today? What are our own cats going mad? Whose voices are we silencing right now? And what minorities are being sacrificed for our current idea of progress?